Imagine going to war with no air force. Not a weak one. Not an underfunded one. No, literally, almost nothing. Now imagine that within 12 months, you become the most powerful air nation on Earth. That is not fiction. That is the United States of America in 1917 and 1918. And the story of how it happened is one of the most jaw-dropping, overlooked, and absolutely extraordinary chapters in the entire history of warfare. So buckle in, because what you are about to hear will completely change how you think about American military power, industrial strength, and the sheer, unstoppable will of a nation that had its back against the wall and refused, absolutely refused, to stay down. Let's take you back. The year is 1917. The First World War has already been raging for nearly 3 years. The fields of France and Belgium are soaked in blood. Millions of men have already died. The empires of Europe have thrown everything they have at each other: artillery, gas, machine guns, and yes, airplanes. And while the British, French, Germans, and Italians have been fighting a war in the skies above the Western Front, developing tactics, building fighters, and training aces who have become national heroes, the United States of America, one of the wealthiest and most industrially capable nations on the planet, has been sitting on the sidelines with virtually no air power at all. When the United States officially entered the First World War on April 6, 1917, the state of American aviation was, to put it charitably, embarrassing. The aviation section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, which is what passed for an air force at the time, had just 55 officers and approximately 1,100 enlisted men. It possessed fewer than 300 aircraft, and of those, not a single one was combat-worthy. Not one. The planes that America had were outdated training models, machines that would have been laughed off any European front. They were slow, fragile, and completely unsuitable for the kind of aerial warfare that was now defining the war in Europe. To understand just how shocking this was, you have to understand what was happening in the skies over France. By 1917, aerial combat had evolved dramatically from the early days of the war, when pilots literally threw bricks and grenades at each other from slow observation planes. By 1917, the Germans had the Albatros D.3, a sleek, powerful biplane that was devastating Allied aircraft. The British were fielding the Sopwith Camel and the Se.5. The French had the Spad-13. These were purpose-built killing machines with synchronized machine guns, capable of over 130 miles per hour, flown by men who had been training and fighting for years. And America had nothing that could compete with any of them. In fact, when independent assessments were made of global air power in 1917, the United States ranked 14th. 14th. Behind nations you might not even associate with air power today. Behind Italy. Behind Russia, which was in the middle of a revolution. Behind Belgium, a country that had been almost entirely occupied by the Germans. The nation that would one day build the B-29 Superfortress, the F-86 Sabre, the State Route 71 Blackbird, and the F-22 Raptor. That nation, in 1917, could barely get a plane off the ground that anyone would take seriously in combat. Now here is where the story gets truly fascinating, because the question is not just where America started. The question is what happened next. And what happened next was one of the most remarkable mobilizations of industrial, financial, human, and political willpower in the history of any nation on Earth. What happened next was that America looked at its embarrassing position, looked at what the war required, looked at what its allies needed, and decided, in the characteristically American way, to go completely, absolutely, and unapologetically all in. The first thing you need to understand is that the declaration of war on April 6, 1917 did not happen in a vacuum. There had been growing pressure in America for months, even years, to begin preparing for the possibility of war. Figures like former President Theodore Roosevelt had been practically screaming from the rooftops that America needed to modernize its military. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 had shaken the public. The Zimmermann Telegram, in which Germany secretly proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, had ignited public fury. But despite all of this, The administration of President Woodrow Wilson had been deeply committed to neutrality and peace. And so, by the time war was finally declared, America had enormous catching up to do. Congress responded almost immediately with an audacity that is almost hard to believe even today. In July of 1917, just 3 months after declaring war, Congress authorized the staggering sum of $640 million for aviation alone. $640 million in 1917 money. To put that in perspective for you, that is roughly equivalent to somewhere between $13 and $15 billion in today's money, in a single appropriation. For aviation, for a country that ranked 14th in the world, it was the largest single appropriation for any military purpose in American history up to that point. And it sent a message to the entire world that America was not playing games. But money alone does not build an air force. And this is where the Raal story begins, because the challenges that America faced in 1917 were not simply financial. They were technological, organizational, logistical, and human. And solving all of those problems simultaneously, in the middle of a global war, while also mobilizing an army of millions of men and shipping them across the Atlantic, that was the true test of what this nation was made of. Let's start with the aircraft problem. America had no combat aircraft. That much we've established. And the obvious solution would seem to be, well, design some and build them. But aircraft design in 1917 was not something you could just do overnight. The Europeans had spent 3 years in brutal combat learning what worked and what didn't. They had paid for those lessons with the lives of thousands of pilots. America didn't have 3 years. America didn't even have 1 year to spare. And so, in what would become one of the most pragmatic and important decisions of the entire war effort, American leadership decided not to reinvent the wheel, but to license and build proven European designs. The centerpiece of this strategy was the French SPAD 13 and the British de Havilland DH.4. These were proven combat aircraft. The SPAD 13 was one of the finest fighters of the entire war, fast, rugged, and deadly in the right hands. The DH.4 was a versatile 2-seat observation and light bombing aircraft that had been blooded in combat over the Western Front. By licensing these designs and adapting them for American production, the United States could get combat-ready aircraft into production far faster than designing something from scratch. But even this decision came with enormous complications. The American automobile industry was the key. Henry Ford had already demonstrated to the world that mass production techniques, the assembly line, standardized parts, interchangeable components, could manufacture complex machines at previously unimaginable speeds and scales. The question was whether those same techniques could be applied to aircraft, which were infinitely more complex and required much higher tolerances than an automobile. The answer, it turned out, was yes, but not without enormous struggle and pain. The aircraft industry in America in 1917 was tiny. It consisted of a handful of small manufacturers who built planes essentially by hand, one at a time, in small workshops. The idea of mass-producing aircraft on an automotive scale was completely foreign to them. And so what followed was an extraordinary and often chaotic process of industrial transformation, as automobile manufacturers, engine builders, and industrial giants were recruited, retooled, and redirected toward the production of aircraft and aircraft engines. The Liberty engine is one of the great engineering stories of the First World War, and it deserves to be far better known than it is. In May of 1917, just weeks after the war declaration, a group of America's finest automotive and aeronautical engineers were assembled, quite literally in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., and given an almost insane task: design a new aircraft engine, from scratch, in 5 days. An engine that would be powerful, reliable, easy to mass produce, and capable of powering multiple different aircraft types. An engine that would be superior to anything the Europeans were currently using. In 5 days. Incredibly, they did it. Well, they produced the initial design in 5 days. The Liberty engine, as it came to be called, was a water-cooled V12 engine that could produce 400 horsepower, extraordinarily powerful for its time. It was designed from the start for mass production, with interchangeable parts and manufacturing simplicity built into its very DNA. And once it went into production, American industry produced it at a scale that was almost incomprehensible. By the end of the war, more than 20,000 Liberty engines had been produced. 20,000. For context, Germany produced roughly 40,000 aircraft engines of all types during the entire war. America nearly matched that output with a single engine design in a fraction of the time. But while the industrial mobilization was underway, there was another enormous problem to solve, and it was in many ways even more urgent than the equipment problem. You can build all the planes in the world, but without trained pilots to fly them, they are just expensive firewood. And America had almost no trained military pilots at all. When the war began, the entire pool of trained military aviators in the United States could be counted in the dozens. And training a combat pilot is not a quick process. It takes months of careful instruction, and in 1917, training was also extremely dangerous. Accidents and crashes killed nearly as many pilots in training as combat did. The training program that America built essentially from nothing in 1917 is one of the unsung marvels of the war. Training fields sprang up across the country, in Texas, in Georgia, in Ohio, in California. The best available instructors were recruited, often from civilian aviation or from Allied military missions. Hundreds of young Americans who had never been near an airplane in their lives were swept up, given physical examinations, put through ground school, and then, with breathtaking speed, placed in aircraft and told to learn to fly. The washout rate was brutal. Many did not make it through, but those who did emerged as pilots, and those pilots were then shipped to Canada, to France, to England for further advanced training on actual combat aircraft. The Lafayette Escadrille is part of this story, and it's a story that deserves a moment of attention because it represents both the best of American spirit and the desperation of the situation before the official war entry. The Lafayette Escadrille was a squadron of American volunteer pilots who had enlisted in the French Foreign Legion and were flying for France as early as 1916 because America hadn't entered the war yet, and these young men couldn't wait. They wanted to fight. They believed in the Allied cause. And so they went to France, learned to fly French aircraft, and fought and died in the skies over Verdun and the Somme while their country was still officially neutral. When America finally entered the war, many of these experienced veterans transferred to the American Air Service, providing a small but invaluable core of actual combat experience around which the new air arm could be built. Now let's talk about the strategic context, because this is essential for understanding what America was actually trying to build toward. The war in the air by 1917 had developed into several distinct roles that aircraft played, and each of these roles required different aircraft, different training, and different tactics. There was fighter aviation, the world of the dogfight, the aerial ace, the one-on-one combat between individual pilots or small formations that captured the public imagination. There was reconnaissance aviation, using aircraft to observe enemy positions, troop movements, and artillery targets, which was arguably the most militarily important role aircraft played. There was bombing, still primitive in 1917 but growing in importance, with both tactical bombing of battlefield targets and the beginning of strategic bombing of industrial and logistical targets behind enemy lines. And there was artillery spotting, working in close coordination with ground artillery to direct fire against targets that the gunners themselves could not see. America needed to develop capability in all of these areas simultaneously, and different areas presented different challenges. Fighter aviation was perhaps the most glamorous, but in some ways the most straightforward. Get good aircraft, train aggressive young pilots, and send them into combat. Reconnaissance was technically demanding and required careful coordination with ground forces. Bombing required not just aircraft and crews, but also bomb-aiming technology, navigation training, and a strategic doctrine for how and where to use it. General John "Black Jack" Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, was deeply committed to the development of American air power. He understood, from the beginning, that the war on the Western Front was partly being won and lost in the air, that whoever controlled the air over the battlefield had an enormous advantage in terms of reconnaissance, artillery support, and the ability to disrupt enemy operations. Pershing fought constantly with both his own government and his allied partners to ensure that American air forces were developed as a genuinely independent and capable arm, rather than simply being parceled out piecemeal to support British and French ground operations. The man Pershing chose to develop and lead American air power in Europe was Brigadier General William Billy Mitchell, and if any one figure can be said to represent the spirit of the American air power revolution of 1917 and 1918, it is Billy Mitchell. Mitchell was brilliant, aggressive, visionary, and almost impossibly difficult to work with. He was the kind of man who was absolutely certain he was right, and who, maddening as that quality was to his superiors, was very often actually correct. Mitchell had been in Europe since 1917, studying Allied air operations and developing his own ideas about how air power should be used. And he was not interested in timid, defensive thinking. Mitchell believed, passionately and with almost evangelical fervor, that air power was not just a supporting arm for ground forces, that it was a war-winning weapon in its own right. He believed in mass, in concentrating aircraft in enormous numbers at decisive points to achieve overwhelming local superiority. He believed in attacking not just the battlefield but the entire enemy system, his supply lines, his airfields, his industrial capacity, his communications. He believed, in essence, in what we would later recognize as strategic bombing doctrine. And in 1918, he got the chance to put some of those ideas into practice, with results that would shape military thinking for the next century. But before we get to 1918, we need to understand just how painful and difficult the transition period of late 1917 was. Because despite the congressional appropriation of $640 million, despite the design decisions and the industrial mobilization and the training programs, the results were slow to arrive, and in the meantime, American pilots were dying in inferior aircraft. The promised flood of American-built combat aircraft was delayed by months, and then more months. Production problems, design complications, supply chain issues, and the sheer organizational complexity of mobilizing an entire new industry meant that the aircraft that had been promised simply weren't showing up in the numbers expected. American squadrons that were supposed to be equipped with American-built machines found themselves flying borrowed French and British aircraft. This was not ideal from a national pride standpoint, but in military terms it was actually the right decision. Better to fly a proven SB-80 or Newport than to wait for an American machine that wasn't ready yet. The DH-4, which was being built in America with the Liberty engine, finally began arriving in France in 1918, and it was a good aircraft, but American pilots had to learn quickly that it had a dangerous tendency to catch fire in combat due to the position of its fuel tank between the pilot and observer, earning it the grim nickname, the Flaming Coffin. Modifications were made, procedures were adapted, and pilots learned to treat their aircraft with the respect that any machine designed to operate at the edge of human capability demanded. Throughout late 1917 and into 1918, American pilots were getting their baptism of fire, flying as part of French and British formations, learning the hard lessons of aerial combat that the Europeans had been learning since 1914. Many of them were very young, 18, 19, 20 years old. Many of them had never fired a gun in anger before they found themselves at 10,000 feet, trying to maneuver a 130-mile-per-hour biplane while a German pilot tried to kill them. The learning curve was brutal, and the casualty rate was horrific. But those who survived were learning, and they were getting good. The names of American aces from this period deserve to be remembered. Eddie Rickenbacker is the most famous, a former racing driver from Columbus, Ohio who became the leading American ace of the war with 26 confirmed aerial victories. Rickenbacker was cool under pressure, technically superb, and a natural leader who cared deeply about the men under his command. But there were others. Frank Luke, the balloon buster from Arizona, who specialized in the extraordinarily dangerous task of attacking observation balloons, which were heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns and fighter escorts, and who scored 18 victories in just 17 days of combat before being killed at the age of 21. Raoul Lufbery, the veteran of the Lafayette Escadrille who became a beloved instructor and mentor before his own death in combat. David Putnam, Douglas Campbell, the first American trained ace. These men, and hundreds like them, were writing the history of American air power in blood and fire. Let's talk about the other side of this story, because to understand the American achievement, you have to understand what they were up against. The German Air Service, the Luftstreitkräfte, was by 1917 the most capable and experienced air arm in the world. It had pioneered many of the fundamental concepts of aerial combat. It had produced legends like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who by early 1917 was already the most successful fighter pilot in history, with dozens of aerial victories to his name. The Germans had developed the concept of the Jagdstaffel, the fighter squadron, and had evolved it into the Jagdgeschwader, larger formations that could concentrate overwhelming force at decisive points. The strategy worked brilliantly, creating periods of German air dominance, most notably the period from September 1916 to June 1917 known as Bloody April in RAF circles, when German pilots were shooting down British aircraft at a catastrophic rate. But by 1917, the situation was beginning to shift, even before American involvement made itself fully felt. The Allies were producing aircraft faster than Germany could match. The British Se.5 and the French SBAD were excellent fighters, and German production was being squeezed by the Allied blockade, which was cutting off the raw materials Germany needed: rubber, copper, certain metals that were essential for aircraft construction. German pilot training was also being compressed as the war dragged on, and experienced men died faster than replacements could be properly prepared. The edge that Germany had in experience and quality was beginning to erode. Into this shifting balance came the Americans, initially in small numbers, gradually in larger ones, and by mid-1918 in numbers that were becoming truly significant. The 1st Aero Squadron, the 94th Aero Squadron, Eddie Rickenbacker's Hat-in-the-Ring Squadron, the 95th, the 96th, the 1st Day Bombardment Group. Unit by unit, squadron by squadron, American air power was assembling itself into something that the Germans had to take seriously. The spring of 1918 brought one of the war's greatest crises, and it was in responding to this crisis that American air power showed what it was becoming. On March 21, 1918, the German army launched Operation Michael, the Great Spring Offensive, a desperate gamble to break through Allied lines and win the war before American troops could arrive in decisive numbers. Using new tactics of infiltration and fast-moving stormtroop assault, the Germans drove deep into the Allied lines, causing a breakthrough of a magnitude not seen since the opening months of the war. It was a genuine emergency. The Allies were staggered, their lines almost broken, Paris threatened. In the air, Allied and American squadrons threw themselves into the battle with a ferocity that was almost suicidal. Low-level attack missions against advancing German columns, bombing of supply lines and bridges, fighter sweeps to contest German air superiority over the breakthrough area. The casualty rates were appalling on all sides, but the air effort played a genuine role in slowing the German advance, disrupting supply and communication, and buying the time that Allied ground forces needed to stabilize the front. It was desperate, improvised, costly fighting, but it worked. And then came the turning point of the entire war, the Allied counteroffensives of the summer and fall of 1918. And it is here that American air power delivered its most dramatic demonstration of what it had become in just over a year. The Battle of Saint-Mihiel in September 1918 was a defining moment. The Saint-Mihiel salient was a large German-held bulge in the French lines, south of Verdun, that the Allies had been unable to reduce for 4 years. General Pershing wanted American forces to eliminate it, demonstrating American military capability and straightening the Allied line. And to support this operation, Billy Mitchell assembled the largest concentration of air power that had ever been gathered in one place in the history of warfare. Mitchell assembled approximately 1,500 aircraft for the Saint-Mihiel offensive. 1,500. American, French, British, Italian, Portuguese, and Belgian aircraft were all brought under his unified command. American squadrons, the 1st Pursuit Group, the 1st Day Bombardment Group, the 1st Corps Observation Group, and others, formed the backbone of this massive air armada. Mitchell organized them in a way that was genuinely revolutionary. Coordinated fighter sweeps to establish air superiority, observation aircraft to direct artillery, tactical bombers to hit enemy airfields, supply depots, and reinforcement routes, and ground attack aircraft to strafe and bomb German troops directly. The operation was a staggering success. American and Allied ground forces captured the salient in just 2 days, a position that the French had been unable to take in 4 years of bloody fighting. And the air campaign played a central role. German air opposition was largely neutralized by the sheer weight of the Allied air assault. German supply and reinforcement was disrupted. German troops, already demoralized by 4 years of war, found themselves attacked from the air as well as the ground, with no respite. More importantly for the long-term history of warfare, Saint-Mihiel demonstrated something that Billy Mitchell had been arguing for years. That air power, properly organized, properly commanded, and properly employed in mass, was not merely a supporting arm for ground forces. It was a war-winning weapon in its own right. That the nation which could establish and maintain air superiority over a battlefield, could see what the enemy was doing, could disrupt his movements, could attack his supplies and communications, could provide its own ground forces with information and protection, that nation had an enormous and possibly decisive advantage. This lesson was learned. Not universally, not immediately. Military institutions are conservative by nature, and there were plenty of generals on all sides who continued to think of aircraft as merely a fancy kind of cavalry, useful for scouting, but not much else. But the evidence of 1918 was impossible to ignore for those who were willing to look at it honestly. And the men who flew and fought and studied those operations. Men like Billy Mitchell. Men like the young officers who would later become the architects of American air power in World War II. They carried those lessons forward, and when the next war came, they would put them into practice on a scale that would have made the operations of 1918 look like a preliminary exercise. Following the triumph of Saint-Mihiel, Mitchell commanded the air operations for the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest military operation in American history, involving over 1 million American troops in a grinding, bloody, but ultimately decisive push that contributed directly to Germany's decision to seek an armistice. American air power supported this operation throughout its 47-day duration, flying thousands of missions, suffering substantial casualties, but providing irreplaceable support to the soldiers fighting below. By November 11, 1918, when the guns finally fell silent on the Western Front, American air power had been transformed beyond recognition from what it had been just 18 months earlier. The U.S. Army Air Service, as it was now formally known, had over 45 squadrons in France and was training and equipping at a rate that would have produced perhaps 200 squadrons by mid-1919 if the war had continued. American industry had produced over 11,000 aircraft during the war period and was ramping up rapidly. The Liberty engine had been produced in quantities that dwarfed anything European manufacturers had achieved. And American pilots, the aces, the veterans, the survivors, had proven themselves equal in skill, courage, and fighting spirit to the best that any nation in the world could produce. The numbers tell the story starkly. 14 in the world in 1917. By the armistice in November 1918, most military analysts placed the United States among the top 3 air powers on Earth, and by some measures, in terms of industrial capacity to produce aircraft and engines, and in terms of the rate of expansion underway, arguably number 1. In 14 months, the United States had gone from having fewer than 300 obsolete, non-combat capable aircraft to operating 45 squadrons in a major theater of war, with the industrial infrastructure to support continued explosive growth. It was, quite simply, one of the most remarkable military buildups in history. But numbers only tell part of the story. The deeper significance of what happened between April 1917 and November 1918 is what it revealed about the nature of American power and American potential. It revealed that the United States possessed, in its industrial base, its educational system, its entrepreneurial culture, and its population of young men willing to take on any challenge, the raw material for military greatness on a scale the world had never seen. The automobile manufacturers who turned their factories to aircraft production, the engineers who designed the Liberty engine in a hotel room in 5 days, the young men who went from never having flown an airplane to dogfighting over the Western Front in a matter of months. These people demonstrated that America, when it decided to act, could do things that seemed impossible. Billy Mitchell understood this more clearly than almost anyone. After the war, he fought a bitter and ultimately career-ending campaign to persuade the American military and political establishment to invest in air power as the decisive weapon of future wars. He was court-martialed in 1925 for his intemperate public attacks on his superiors and resigned from the army. But he was vindicated, tragically, posthumously, when the Second World War demonstrated that every major strategic prediction he had made was correct. Air power would be decisive. Battleships could be sunk by aircraft. The nation that controlled the skies controlled the battlefield. He had known all of this in 1918, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to make others see it. The legacy of 1917 and 1918 extends far beyond the armistice. The men and machines and ideas of that brief, extraordinary period planted the seeds of everything that came after. The strategic bombing doctrine developed by Julio de Hette and enthusiastically adopted by American air power theorists, the idea that you could win a war by destroying an enemy's industrial capacity and will to fight through sustained bombing campaigns, grew directly from the lessons of 1918. The concept of air superiority as the prerequisite for all other military operations grew from the same roots. The organizational structures, the independent air arm operating under its own command and pursuing its own strategic objectives, that became the United States Army Air Forces in 1941 and the United States Air Force in 1947. These were built on foundations laid between 1917 and 1918. The pilots and officers who learned their trade over the Western Front went on to build the greatest air force the world had ever seen. Carl Spaatz, who flew combat missions with the 13th Aero Squadron in 1918, commanded the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe in World War II, the force that shattered Germany's industrial capacity and paved the way for the Allied victory. Frank Andrews, Ira Eaker, Hap Arnold especially, who served as a military aviator from before World War I and became the commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces in World War II, overseeing an air arm of 2.4 million men and 80,000 aircraft. These men were shaped, fundamentally and indelibly, by the experience of 1917 and 1918. And the industrial capacity that was built up during World War I established patterns and relationships between government, industry, and the military that persisted and grew. The auto manufacturers who learned to build aircraft engines, the toolmakers who learned to fabricate airframes, the engineers who learned to design for mass production. This human and institutional capital did not disappear when the war ended. It lay dormant during the lean years of the 1920s and 1930s, but when the next crisis came, when production orders began flowing again in 1939 and 1940, that knowledge and capability came back to life with extraordinary speed. The ramp-up of American aviation production in World War II, from a few thousand aircraft per year to 100,000 aircraft per year in the space of a few years, was possible because the foundations had been laid in 1917 and 1918. There is also a human story here that deserves to be told. The story of the young Americans who went to war in the air and did not come back. Of the approximately 1,600 Americans who flew in combat during World War I, several hundred were killed, shot down over enemy lines, killed in accidents, dead of disease, or the thousand other ways that war finds to take young lives. They were students, farmers, mechanics, athletes, adventurers. They were 18 and 19 and 20 years old. They climbed into machines that were in many ways barely more sophisticated than the bicycle that the Wright brothers had mechanized just 14 years earlier, flew them into skies full of men who wanted to kill them, and performed deeds of almost unimaginable courage. Their names are on memorials in France, in Washington, in small towns across America. They deserve to be remembered. Frank Luke, the balloon buster, is worth a final word. Luke was wild and undisciplined and drove his commanding officers to distraction. But in the air, he was something close to supernatural. In September 1918, in a period of 17 days, he shot down 14 observation balloons and 4 aircraft. An almost incomprehensible achievement given that balloons were the most heavily defended targets in the entire war, ringed with anti-aircraft guns and always escorted by fighter aircraft. On September 29, 1918, after being ordered to land and face disciplinary action for ignoring orders, Luke instead took off on one last mission, shot down 3 more balloons, was badly wounded, made a forced landing behind German lines, and then, surrounded by German troops demanding his surrender, drew his pistol and fought until he was killed. He was 21 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He was, in miniature, everything that the American spirit in the air had become: audacious, aggressive, supremely skilled, and absolutely unwilling to quit. The story of American air power going from 14th in the world to the dominant air power on Earth in 14 months is ultimately a story about what happens when a nation truly decides to do something. Not talks about doing it, not allocates some money to think about it, but truly, fully, completely commits to it. The $640 million appropriation was the decision. The Liberty engine, designed in 5 days, was the execution. The pilots trained in months rather than years, flying borrowed French aircraft until American machines were ready, learning under fire and teaching each other. That was the sacrifice and the dedication. And the result: 45 squadrons in France, 1,500 aircraft concentrated at Saint-Mihiel. The creation of an industrial and military infrastructure for air power that would shape the entire 20th century. That was the payoff. We often forget how young American aviation was when this all happened. The Wright brothers made their first successful powered flight at Kitty Hawk on December 17, 1903. 14 years. 14 years from Kitty Hawk to the United States ranking 14th in the world and being declared at war. 14 months more, and American air power was transformed into a genuine world-class fighting force. 14 years and 14 months. From a wooden and canvas glider engine hybrid struggling into the air over the Outer Banks of North Carolina, to 1,500 aircraft assembled over Saint-Mihiel in the greatest air armada the world had ever seen. In historical terms, that is not just rapid development. That is instantaneous. That is a revolution compressed into the span of a single human adolescence. The lessons of 1917 and 1918 echoed through the entire 20th century. In World War II, America produced more aircraft than the rest of the world combined. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-29 Superfortress executed the strategic bombing campaigns that Billy Mitchell had envisioned in 1918. P-51 Mustangs flew escort missions over the Reich, destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to contest Allied air superiority. American aircraft carriers, themselves a concept that grew from the recognition of air power's dominance that emerged from World War I, fought and won the decisive naval battles of the Pacific. By 1945, American air power was so supreme, so overwhelming, so utterly beyond anything any other nation possessed, that it ended the war in the Pacific with 2 bombs dropped from a single aircraft each time. And it all started in 1917, with a nation that had nothing, 55 officers, fewer than 300 obsolete aircraft, no combat experience, no established industry, and 14 months to build something that would change the world forever. That is the story of American Air Power's birth. That is the story of how a nation went from 14th to 1st in a single, extraordinary year. And if you take nothing else away from this story, take this. The measure of a great power is not where it starts. The measure of a great power is what it does when it decides to move. The war ended. The aircraft were mothballed. The pilots went home to their farms and their offices and their garages. The great training fields fell quiet. The factories retooled back to automobiles and washing machines and refrigerators. But something had changed that could never be unchanged. America had learned what it was capable of in the air, and the world would never forget the lesson. Now I want you to think about something, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We have talked today about a nation that went from 14th in the world in air power to number 1 in 14 months, because it made a decision and backed that decision with everything it had. We live in a world today where new technologies, artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, drone warfare, space-based weapons, are changing the nature of military power just as rapidly and just as fundamentally as the airplane changed it between 1914 and 1918. And the question I want to leave you with is this. If America found itself ranked 14th in one of those critical new technologies, as some analysts argue it already is in certain areas of drone warfare or artificial intelligence, do you believe this country still has the capacity, the industrial base, the political will, and the national spirit to do in the 21st century what it did in 1917 and 1918? Or has something changed? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it surprised you, if it made you think, hit that subscribe button, because we have many more stories like this one waiting for you. The history of military power is full of moments when everything changed in an instant, and this channel exists to make sure you never miss them.